Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula with Adam and Rob. On this episode, we're gearing up for the first triple header of the season, and Rob, this time last year we were begging the fantasy gods for some parity in the game, and now this year we're getting whiplash from all the twists and turns of the first 9 races. How are you holding up?
Yeah, I think to be top 4,000 after 9 races so far, I can't say that's a bad result for either of us. So you're not wrong. Plenty of twists and turns, but I do think that even though there's more variety in the game than ever right now, I definitely think there'll be a definite convergence of teams and decisions as we approach Austria in a couple of weeks' time.
It's definitely been an interesting few weeks for us. We're going to talk about how things went in Canada last time out. I know things went a lot better for you, Rob, than they did for my team. So hopefully, for those of you that are in the same boat as I am, we can start moving forward together in the positive direction. And then our hit list this week is going to be as important as ever because we have topics that cover every part of your lineup, plus a special look ahead to later in the season and how we can plan for that starting with this week. And then we're going to end the show tonight with Rob leading us through another lineup build for 3 different prices, since we may be starting this week from different teams because there was a lot of movement heading into Canada last time out. Rob, as we start the show tonight with winners and losers, who was your first winner?
I had Lewis Hamilton as my first winner for Canada. He came away with 32 points and the fastest lap, the third highest score for that weekend, and his best result for the season. So I think Mercedes are certainly on an upward trajectory, and I think you'll continue that in the theme of the constructor shortly. But I really like that Lewis is certainly consistently performing. The last 5 races, he's had 4 of the 5 scores above 20 points, or 20 or more points, I should say. So I definitely think Mercedes have closed the gap after a pretty slow start to the season for them. And I fully expect now that we are getting into the European stages of the race, I feel like they also have a much better understanding of the car and what the upgrades can essentially be used each race to improve the performance. I think we'll start to see a bit more from them, and hopefully for your sake as a fan of the team, a few more podiums too.
Here, here.
Well, who have you got for your first winner after Canada?
So let's continue that theme with Mercedes as a constructor. So there was a buzz around Mercedes really once FP3 finished because you had Hamilton and Russell both in the top 3, but the Silver Arrows delivered the rest of the weekend too, which they seldom do. P3 for Russell, P4 for Hamilton, and the constructor tallied a season high 74 points to lead all constructors. And you and I had discounted Mercedes in recent weeks, Rob, but they've scored 40 or more points in 5 straight races, second only to Red Bull in that stretch. They also have the most points of any constructor since Imola, so they've really taken the corner, and they're providing a lot of value as a Tier B constructor that can also get us some good cost cap gains too. So we're going to talk a bit later about whether or not Mercedes can keep it up in Spain, but they have some excellent momentum going forward.
Yeah, I'm really liking their momentum, and I think they'll be a very popular team if they can continue this good form heading into Europe. In terms of my second winner, I had Nico Hulkenberg, and I think you could make a case for several different midfield drivers as a winner for the weekend in Canada, but I was particularly impressed, maybe after we saw the success of them going on to that wet tire in the race, all those overtakes that Nico and Kevin Magnussen were able to rack up within a number of early laps. And I think once you got those 13 overtakes on the board, or several, I think close to a dozen of those, before they changed tyres, it was a foregone conclusion that they'd be going up in price after the weekend. So 19 points was his best result of the season, and Kevin Magnussen's 14, even though he's not on the screen here, had his second best fantasy result of the season, and also a handy $1 million increase as well. So great result for the Haas drivers, particularly following a disappointing weekend in Monaco where they were disqualified and DNF'd.
What a rebound it is for Haas. And I hope those of you that had Haas at Monaco stuck with them and didn't just cut bait on them, because you would have missed a really good week. My second winner was Esteban Ocon, and of all my picks on this show last week, I really nailed this one with Ocon. He started P18 because he had that penalty coming from Monaco, and he finished P10, and it was a double points finish for Alpine, so a really wonderful week for him. His 16 fantasy points were fueled by his 7 overtakes and 8 positions gained, so great result for Esteban. I think he actually could have gotten more points had the 2 Saubers not started from the pit lane. I was actually disappointed to see some of those penalties come in on Sunday morning. but he also had the most fantasy points by an Alpine driver this year, and he gained that $1 million in price as we were predicting on this show. So hopefully he can carry that momentum going forward because he's still auditioning for a seat next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Looks like those Alpine predictions of yours are finally coming to fruition as a team to watch. So I think they're heading in the right direction, and I'm really liking both Ocon and Gasly as we move forward into Europe. I think to the contrary, though, my first loser this week was a team more so that's unlike Ocon, very much in the forefront of our thinking week to week. And Ferrari had, by no uncertain terms, an absolute stinker of a weekend. Their worst result. Going back 2.5 years to when F1 Fantasy Tools started recording data, their worst result ever in F1 Fantasy with -16. So a disastrous double DNF for them, and a complete opposite to how Haas's fortunes fared in Monaco, where they were both out. Ferrari were on the podium there, and a complete change of fortunes this time around. So terrible outcome for Sainz, a terrible outcome for Leclerc, and if you owned 1, 2, or 3 Haas assets, it wasn't a great weekend for an F1 fantasy strategist.
No, it was definitely a tough weekend for Ferrari, and we're going to talk about all of the different calamities that hit them this weekend, but it's the first time that they had been out of Q2 since... I think it was Belgium 2021 I saw. It had been years since neither Ferrari made Q3. So very, very tough weekend for them. Similarly, my first loser is a constructor, and it's Red Bull. Another I told you so from this show last week. We warned you about Sergio Perez's qualifying issues in Canada. He failed to make it out of Q1 once again. And starting at that part of the grid where bad things tend to happen, it happened to Perez. He had that contact with Gasly on the opening lap. That set him back for the early part of the race. He completed just 3 overtakes before he dropped 2 of his wheels on the wet grass and then put that RB20 into the barrier, so ended his day early. And to spare Verstappen of the safety car, Perez had to trundle around the track with that damage, and then he ended up taking a penalty for this weekend as well. So a really terrible result for Perez. Even with the race winner Verstappen on that Red Bull constructor, they only scored 25 points. So until Checo can sort out these qualifying woes, which are now an annual thing this time of year, I'm going to seat Red Bull.
Yeah, I think it very much reaffirmed that the Red Bull constructor heavily leans on Perez to just keep it on track to deliver a score above 40 or so. And Max, as you pointed out, won the race, did all he could, and had in my opinion, his best race of the season, to come from, well, he was only P2, which wasn't far, but given the circumstances of the race and the conditions on track, I think he drove excellently. So Perez really letting the team down there. My second loser was Tsunoda, and I didn't think, up until he spun out towards the end of the race, I thought he drove soundly on all accounts. Those -6 positions he lost was very much largely attributed to the fact that he hit the grass and never really recovered afterwards. And I do think that even though it was his worst result of the season, bar DNFs, and since Australia, where he had -1s in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, it wasn't a terrible drive. I still think Tsunoda going forward remains very viable, much like Ferrari. I just think it was one of those off weeks, but when it was his worst drive since China, and everyone has seemed to have piled on him in the last couple of weeks, given how well he has been driving, it's not a great weekend for him, but I'm confident Yuki will bounce back in Spain.
And it wasn't all bad for Yuki because Terry actually broke on our live show that Yuki received his contract extension last weekend. So not a terrible weekend for him, but in terms of F1 fantasy, it was a rough go for him. Yuki's usually a winner in this space, and I also have a loser that is usually a winner, and that's Charles Leclerc. And we were just talking about how he had this streak of 10 races with at least 20 or more fantasy points. That got snapped in a pretty epic way. This weekend was a total fiasco. Missed Q3. Found himself dealing with a power unit issue that had him lagging for the first part of the race. Ferrari pitted him. Sounds like they solved the power unit issue, but then they fitted him with hard tires to hope that the rain would miss him. It didn't. He was losing like 40, 45 seconds a lap. So then by that point, it basically just become a practice session. They ended his day early. So the result was a -16 for us. A lot of people had Charles. He was owned on 35% of teams. And as a 2X driver, that means we faced a minus 32 on the weekend. Rob, you had talked about how the Ferrari score was the lowest in the 3 years that F1 Fantasy Tools had been working. Same thing for Charles and his minus 16. It was an all-time stinker. So really, really bad luck for the Ferrari team all around.
Yeah, I wanted to pour one out for you on the weekend, Adam. It was bad enough to own Charles Leclerc and take that minus 16, but anyone with the 2X, it's just salt in the wound there. So condolences for F1 Fantasy in Canada.
They pulled out the fastest pit stop, thank goodness, but it was otherwise just a really lousy weekend for them all the way around. All right, let's move down to our fifth gear GARMS question for this week. As a reminder, if you head over to the Fantasy Formula base on the FanAmp app, you have a chance to win a great prize from our sponsor, Fifth Gear GARMS. This week's question is, does the Mercedes constructor finish in the top 3 for fantasy scoring? So, Rob, we had mentioned a moment ago that they had been in the top 3 for several races. They're on a great streak. I think they do it again. What about you?
I think it's a tough one to pick, to be honest, because their success lately has been based on attrition from other drivers in the top teams, namely Perez and the Ferrari duo. But I do think the car is certainly, if not within the top 3 teams, just on the outside. So I do think it's a much harder prediction to make than, say, previous weeks. I will say no, but I think it's going to be very close because I expect Perez will bounce back in Spain. It's very much a Red Bull track with a lot of straights and higher speed corners. And I do think that, assuming a good result for Red Bull, Ferrari also, you can't see them going out the way they did in Canada, and McLaren's consistency. I think it could be very, very close, but I think it may only be separated by five points or so between third and fourth. So I'm going to say no for the sake of being different, but I wouldn't be surprised if they do crack the top 3 too.
Wonderful. So we want to hear what you think too. Head on over to FanAmp. Let us know if Mercedes will be a top 3 constructor this week. And Fifth Gear GARMS is having a big week as well. They just launched a brand new partnership with Gravel Trap Graphics, and now you can get a whole new line of gear from their website. So I recommend you head over to fifthgeargarms.com because that's all new this weekend as well.
If you like Gravel Trap Graphics, there's 3 behind me on the wall here. So I really love their prints, and I'm looking forward to seeing what is new in stock for them.
Fantastic. Now let's head on over to our hit list. And the first topic for the hit list tonight is about Max Verstappen. And Rob, it's been over 700 days since Max has lost back-to-back races. And even with some gremlins in the car, other constructors gaining places around him, Max pulled off the win in Canada. And we say here that Max is back, but maybe Max never really left.
No, I have to agree with you. I just think the emergence of Leclerc as a 2X option, the improvement of Mercedes lately, and then obviously Lando's driver of the day stranglehold makes me think that Max maybe just wasn't part of the conversation for a place in our teams, particularly on those non-sprint weekends where the gulf between the top scorers is much smaller. So I think that 37-point haul from P2 to P1 was a great result for Max and a much needed boost for the team after really struggling in Monaco. I do think he deserves inclusion in a lot of our teams, and I think I've got one eye on him for Austria too, where he has an exceptional record. So I'm really liking the look of Max. I think he's really hitting his stride again at the right time, and there's a few European tracks coming up that Red Bull typically look very good at too.
I totally agree. And people forget that Max has the 2 highest scoring weeks by a driver despite not winning a single driver of the day, which has basically become a popularity contest once you hit the podium places. And you had mentioned his form in Austria. His form in Spain's pretty awesome too. Running on back-to-back wins the last 2 races and 6 straight podiums here. So if you're going to bring Max back into your lineup after a little break with Charles and Lando, now's the time to do it.
Yeah, definitely.
So we talk about Max because there are so many drivers that are appropriate 2X candidates for our teams these last few weeks. We see Max is making a surge, and he might be a good driver to bring back in these next few races. Lando has been on a tear lately. I had Charles Leclerc, but then so many of you brought in Lewis Hamilton and benefited in the last race too. So Rob, where do we kick off this week, and who looks like the best 2X options for you?
It's, I think, tougher than it's ever been, and I think that's a really good sign for F1 Fantasy that there's so much optionality and variety to choose and design your lineups. I wouldn't say there's an outright answer that I could give you right now, but I think the momentum for me is probably with Verstappen, not just because of Spain alone, but the fact that he also is particularly appealing in Austria makes me think carrying him for a couple of weeks could certainly be a more viable strategy than going for someone like, I don't know, let's say Lewis Hamilton on the back of a good result in Canada, but may not be as good over these next couple of race weekends. I think Lando and Charles are excellent. Ferrari, I would like to think, bounce back in Spain, and then Lando's just always going to be there. He's always very consistent, hasn't had a DNF this season, although I had a habit of jinxing him last year in Vegas when I said the same thing. So I think there's a number of different options on the table, and I don't think as of right now there's a wrong answer, but I'm really fascinated by what practice has in store for us.
I think for me, I definitely owe Lando an apology because I wasn't giving him the respect he deserved as a 2X driver. He's finally there. He's been the highest scoring driver in 2 of the last 3 races, obviously leads the driver of the day category on the year. And since the start of 2023, Max and Lando have as many 1-2 podium finishes as Max and Checo. And so that's how strong the last season and a half has been for Lando Norris. So I think he's going to stand out as a really strong 2X candidate this week. I think the only one I would rule out heading into Spain is probably Lewis. I think the rest of them could all be on the table depending on your budget situation and how practice looks. I'm so excited for practice this week because I think we're going to have some dry sessions, some very predictive sims on a track that these drivers have all raced at several times. So we should have a much more comfortable sense of what our lineups will be.
And also more overtakes on the table too. A circuit that, which we'll get into in a minute, has a lot more opportunity for making passes, an extra DRS zone compared to the case in Monaco and Imola, for example. So I think we're going to see a few higher scores than usual heading into Spain.
Let's get right into that, Rob, because the last 2 races, the midfield has been struggling. The overtakes have been reduced because we had a twisting, turning course at Monaco. We had the rain in Canada. And if you weren't a Haas driver, you didn't get a whole lot of that overtake action. Not to mention, there were 9 DNFs over that 2-race span, so the midfield really got beat up. So now is a chance for those midfield drivers to really start earning their keep and getting us some points. And you can see on the screen here, the Spanish GP has been in the top 5 for overtakes each of the last 2 years. So I think we're going to see some more action on track.
Yeah, exactly. Fully agree. I think when you're averaging by driver 2.5 overtakes per driver, there's going to be a lot more weighted towards the back of the field. And I think looking at the likes of Tsunoda, Stroll, the Alpine duo, the Haas guys are probably the ones that are going to be racking up most of those. So I do think there's quite a number of good options to bolster our team, and maybe with the Red Bull constructor, not the most popular option at the moment, having a bit more budget to reassign to those midfield drivers and move away from the Williams and Sauber ones that some of us have been running the last couple of weeks actually doesn't seem like a bad strategy on paper at the moment anyway.
Absolutely. And for those of you that want a little history on overtakes at this circuit, Zhou Guanyu led the grid last year with 10 overtakes, and Zhou and Tsunoda are the only 2 drivers in the top 10 for overtakes in each of the last 2 Spanish Grand Prix. So something to keep in mind there. And then the other thing I like about this course is that it's had a pretty low DNF rate recently. All 20 drivers reached a checkered flag last year, and you have to go back to 2018 for the last time we saw more than 2 DNFs in Spain. So if you have to run Sauber, Logan Sargent, Lance Stroll for the sake of bringing in Max or other expensive assets, this might be the week to do it.
That's true. Just as I think I'm losing faith with Sargent, you give me one more reason to keep him in my team for just one extra week, Adam. So I really hope if I do end up with him for Spain, he can come through with a massive 3-point performance. But I do think you make a good point that there's probably worse weekends to run the less reliable drivers on the grid.
Sargent, I'm looking at his last 4 races now, -7, -2, 1, and -19. So we might still have to take an antacid before that race, regardless of how safe that race looks.
I knew that would come back to bite me at some point, that DNF that I just thought was coming but never did. But we can always speculate with all of the rumors swirling around his seat and Kimi Antonelli's license, or the license the FIA have now approved for 17-year-olds, whether or not Sargent even has a spot on the grid for the rest of the season. Anyway, that's a discussion for another time.
It sure is, and we might just get to it in a few minutes too. And so, as we move down from the 2X driver to the midfield, let's take a pit stop and talk about the constructors this week. So, we heard in the winners section about Mercedes' consistency in recent races, and a lot of strategists have been asking, is their luck due to run out? But their recent form in Spain lets me think that maybe they're going to be okay. And this lends itself to my answer to the fifth gear Garms contest question earlier in the show. Russell has back-to-back P3 finishes in Spain since he joined Mercedes. Hamilton hasn't finished lower than P5 in his last 5 races, and he had 3 wins in a row before the last 2 seasons, which were both podium finishes. So, Rob, he's looking really, really good here. What stops him from picking it back up?
I don't think there's a reason to go against them if they look solid in practice. I think, much like Red Bull and other omens you've said that are favouring certain drivers and teams heading into the weekend. I believe Mercedes have been in the top 5 at Spain for the last 4 seasons. So it's a circuit they certainly love to race at based on the car they deliver, and the running order going back the last 4 seasons, because there seems to be a bit of chatter I've seen on Twitter around Red Bull for I think the last 3 seasons. Red Bull, Mercedes, and a Ferrari driver have occupied the top 3 spots, and you go back a couple more seasons, and Mercedes seem to be, and Max, the only consistent teams or drivers, I should say, that are featuring in and around the top 5. So Max and Mercedes, the Hamver bot, maybe not Bottas nowadays, but Hamver Russ or some variation of that, I think is a good and encouraging sign if you're running Mercedes heading into the weekend. And, you've talked about their recent good form. Australia just seems to be the only blemish on a very consistent season otherwise. So I'm really liking it. And given that I have Mercedes as my second constructor with Ferrari, all I need to see is some very solid times in free practice to keep them for one more week.
And that's what I wanted to get into. What do we make of this information about Mercedes? If you roll them into this week and you're using all your transfers on some of the previous topics we talked about, you're moving around your drivers and you don't have any left, you can keep Mercedes as your constructor and be just fine. Whereas if you don't have Mercedes and you want to stick with a combination of McLaren and Ferrari, for example, like I do, there's no pressure either. I think there are some really good constructors, regardless of what your situation is with your drivers, that a lot of these will work for you going into this week.
Definitely agree. And I think what we're about to get into in terms of different builds for different lineups makes me think that there's more a case than ever to run Mercedes compared to, say, weeks prior. Before we change gears into our next hit list item, I want to cover off our Fan Amp picks of the week. And as we've talked about before, you can jump onto the Fan Amp app, submit your picks, and you'll be entered in to the draw for all these great prizes that are on offer week to week. The question for the week is, how many points in the championship will Mercedes score? Adam, what's your initial thoughts on that for the Silver Arrows?
I was trying to run those numbers really fast in my head. I'm going to go with 20 championship points. So that's assuming that they're somewhere around P4, P6. What about you?
Okay, that's a fair assessment. I did say that it was going to be close earlier between Mercedes and the other top 3 teams, but I think doing a quick back of the napkin calculation, I'm going to say 10 or less, but I think again it'll be close. It'll probably be on the nose, anywhere between 9 and 13, 14, but for again the sake of being different, I'll go 10 or less, which you probably are furious of hearing.
Let it slide this time, Rob, but I'm extra proud of the boys after what they did last week. I think 20's in the cards for them. All right, let's move on to hit list item number 5, and that is that the lineup choices we make this week could be informed by some future-facing news. Rob's been mentioning throughout the show that the next race is a sprint weekend. These are the events that Max is notoriously really good at. He has an incredible history at Austria, and so there are some decisions we can make with our lineup now to prevent us from making a lot of transitions into that lineup. Rob, is there any other assets besides Verstappen that you recommend we start investing in now with the Austria sprint up ahead?
I mean, it's hard to say objectively what the best or optimal strategy or team lineup is without seeing practice, but I think the only driver that stands out to me as someone that's probably not going to be on the radar after Austria at the very latest, unless they have a DNF, is Lance Stroll. And I'd like to get into the 4 other drivers on screen here in a moment too. But Stroll's approaching the B tier. He's 14.2 million, so at most has 2 races of 0.5 million increases before he gets into that class. And I think by that point doesn't really become a viable fantasy asset to own. So I think if you're looking at a midfield driver in a car that, in my opinion, is P5 or P6 at the very worst, he becomes a very good option for budget gain and a solid source of midfield points. So I think he is one option I really like to plan for. And even though he has had a couple of DNFs, he's coming off his second best performance of the season at his home Grand Prix in Canada with 14. So if that continues, I think he's certainly worth thinking about.
A move I'm really considering right now is I have Charles and Lewis in my lineup. If you have an extra 0.4 million lying around, you can move to Max and Lance. So then you get the high points upside, the high cost cap upside, as long as you have that extra cost cap lying around with your 2 free transfers, and then otherwise a pretty good team that you're carrying over from Canada. So that's sticking out to me a lot. And then, Rob, you had brought up this great point offline about how some of the driver market news could impact the strategies on track and then ultimately the impact in fantasy. And we saw some of those post-race sound bites from Esteban Ocon. He was pretty upset with Alpine. How do you see the other drivers that are definitely changing teams in 2025 and how they'll be treated by their teams?
It's hard to say. I think Ocon, of the 4 drivers on screen here, is probably the one most at risk just because he looks to have burnt those bridges with the team already. I think it's going to be apparent that as we move towards the latter stages of the season, Sainz, Hamilton and Hülkenberg will undoubtedly be phased out of certainly the more technical components of team strategy and the build of the car and all of that stuff, just so they don't ultimately bring that onto the team they move on to next season. But I would be very surprised if it becomes apparent right now. I think of the other 3 drivers, Ocon aside, I don't even know if there's a right or a wrong answer for which one gets team orders more so. But it seems to me of those 3, Hamilton already seems to receive less preferential treatment than George Russell. It sounds as though George has better qualifying performance as a result of receiving additional parts of the car. Leclerc is the golden boy for Ferrari, so I'm not sure. And Sainz's performance has tailed off relative to his teammate in the last couple of races. Hülkenberg's a difficult one because he's objectively the better driver on that Haas team. So I do wonder if they're going to sacrifice any constructor or driver points at the expense of Magnussen or vice versa. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. What's your thoughts there?
I totally agree with your point about Lewis at Mercedes. We saw George Russell get that new front wing back in Monaco, and then that's where his qualifying performances started to improve. Lewis got it the last time out, and they both got that level up from it. So I think, especially with respect to upgrades, you might see George get them before Lewis. I don't think there'll be so much on team orders for someone with the kind of legacy that Lewis has, the way it was with Ocon, but definitely some of those upgrades could favor Russell. As for Haas, I wonder if Kevin Magnussen's even in the future for them. So unlike the Golden Boy situation with Ferrari, they might just say, you're both gone next year, so just go do the best you can. So I think there won't be any of that stickiness at Haas. Ocon is clearly in the crosshairs of his team leadership, so I think he really needs to be careful, but do enough to earn himself a race seat next year.
You're right. It could very well be that Ocon actually slots into Hülkenberg's seat next year. At least that's what some of the rumours are tying him to anyway. And in terms of the sprint in Austria, we've talked about that already a little bit on the show. But what do you think in terms of chip usage and strategy could ultimately come up for strategists heading into that race weekend?
Well, for those of you who haven't used Limitless, we think this is the last great opportunity to use that chip. Hopefully by then there's a pretty stable understanding of how the 2X drivers and constructors all fit in ahead of that race. But once we get to the second half of the season, budgets are going to start growing and that Limitless advantage is going to start getting cut down. So we highly recommend you use it by that Austria sprint if you haven't already.
Yeah, we're already seeing many teams field 4 premium driver and constructor lineups with the likes of Piastri, Leclerc, Ferrari, McLaren, for example, compared to many teams only being able to field 3 premium driver and constructors around the China and US Grand Prix. So I think by the time we get to the 4th sprint, which just looking along the calendar here, isn't until Austin, if I'm not mistaken. That by that point we may well have 4 or 5 premium drivers and constructors in our team.
It's going to be interesting to see how the last few races shape up. We're heading into this stretch of 5 race weekends out of the next 6 calendar weekends, so it's going to be a busy time for all of us. Rob, let's head into some of our lineup builds for this week. Lead us through where you're starting this week with, and what are some of the options for those teams that we can start pivoting into?
Yeah, there's so many different combinations that we've talked about, and I think certainly planning for Austria should be in the back of your mind. It doesn't have to be front of mind with Spain coming right up. But I think given that several people have probably already used their wild card and may only be carrying a couple of transfers, maybe having 3 transfers rolling into Austria wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Now, I've got my test team up on the screen here, which currently has a budget of 117 million, and we'll probably be able to go with some different combinations as we go through the first 2 different tiers, but by the third, we'll caveat that we won't be able to fill all 7 slots. But I think at 110 million, given that's probably a price you'd say is for people who have maybe joined halfway through the season, or maybe haven't been focusing on their team with budget front of mind, I think starting with someone like Verstappen is probably not the worst idea in the world because of his recent consistency, the fact he does very well at the Red Bull Ring, and Spain also looks like a track that he's going to do very well at and has good history at. So I think we start with Max there and then focus on the constructors as the next best priority for building out that team. What's your take on how these next 2 slots could fill up?
I think once you have that premium driver in the 2X slot, if you fill the constructors with 2 tier B assets, particularly Ferrari and Mercedes, they're both on a roll. They're both cheap. They could both gain a bunch of value. I think these are some great options.
And then I think for the midfield and back market drivers, reliability and consistency is probably the name of the game there. So I'm inclined to go for, let's say, double Haas for now, steer clear of the Saubers if we can. We've still got 41 million in the bank. So I think Hulkenberg and Magnussen probably aren't the worst 2 midfield combos going around, which leaves us with 23, which is still a fair bit of money, all things considered. So who would you slot in there after these 2 guys?
So in my particular case, I'm about out of transfers by the time I get to these 2 positions. So I would just roll Ocon and Sargent from the previous race over, which fits the bill for that price range. You could do different combinations like you had mentioned. We could go with some of the Saubers, messing around with Pierre Gasly, just whatever it takes to get some of that back marker value in. I think I have to roll with Sargent again this week, but I think Ocon could have another good race. That Alpine has looked strong the last few weeks. They've been contending for points a lot more, so he's still a tier C asset, and I like what he can bring from that cost cap game.
I think, though, yeah, perfectly agree with that. I think, going back to your point, though, the midfield guys should be the lowest priority. So if you've got 4 other drivers in here, let's say Bottas, Zhou, Tsunoda, and Gasly, for example, there's nothing wrong at all with running those guys as opposed to what the 4 we have on screen here. So I think that's the foundations of a very good lower budget team. But I think if we're moving towards the next tier, 115 million, there's probably a few different things we could tweak in this lineup.
Yeah, so for 115 million, there's no reason to not have Verstappen and Stroll. And then with that, you have all the points upside, the rich legacy at this track from Max. You have maybe the last opportunity for Stroll, because Rob, you had suggested earlier, if Stroll has 2.5 million increases, he'll be out of tier C, but he could just have another million like he had in Canada. So this could be the last opportunity to really extract that value from Lance. I want to try to get one last bite out of the apple with him. So then once you get to the bottom of your lineup, you can do it one of a few ways. You could go with McLaren and Ferrari, and then the cheapest possible back markers, or McLaren Mercedes, and then a combination of Hulkenberg, Zhou, Sargent, so maybe one step off the bottom, depending on what your preference is on the constructors.
Yeah, I think as well having at least one tier B constructor is also hedging against lower or a little bit more price increase as opposed to running, for argument's sake, McLaren and Red Bull, which are both going to have much smaller budget increases. So I like having Mercedes or Ferrari in this second slot. And then you mentioned the back markers. Let's drop in the Sauber guys. That gives us 8.8. You could get to, I realize this is 115, so you'd probably have to get Sargent in that case. And that would, I think, come in just under 114 million. So that's not a bad team at all. But you could also alternatively go for Ferrari, as you pointed out. They'll be bouncing back, I think, in Spain.
Absolutely. And then once we move up to the last tier of 120 million, you can take the lineup that Rob has on screen here and just upgrade one of those drivers. Just throw an extra 5 million somewhere. I don't know, Rob, which of those, are there any obvious candidates to just move up 5 million?
Yeah, I think let's just, for argument's sake, leave Max and Lance Stroll in, then we'll drop in Sauber again. I think Sargent, I do think, to your point earlier, that the lower DNF risk isn't as much of an issue, but if you can still move off him, I think that's not a bad move at all. Also, considering that we mentioned before, if in the off chance he is replaced and there's speculation that this license for Andrea Antonelli could just be for the free practice sessions that he runs in a Williams car this season, then that's likely to have no effect on Logan Sargent's seat. But in the very rare occurrence he is replaced mid-season by Antonelli, maybe just getting away from him now isn't the worst idea in the world either. So you mentioned an extra 5 million. I don't quite have the budget for on this team going up to that, but instead of Albon, if you had an extra 2 million, you could sneak in someone like a Yuki Tsunoda or a Pierre Gasly, for argument's sake.
Absolutely. And you could also move Stroll to Alonso if you thought that there was something there, maybe Alonso contending for a top 5 finish, but I really like what Stroll can bring from the cost cap gain. I want to throw one crazy idea out there because just to show the power of these bigger budgets, I see a lineup with Leclerc, Russell, Stroll, Zhou, and Logan Sargent with McLaren and Ferrari that still fits in this budget. So you can run a slightly lower 2X driver with sort of a 2B level driver in George Russell, the cost cap upset as Stroll, 2 good constructors, and then some back markers. So a lot of stuff to play around with this week.
That is a behemoth of a team if I ever saw one, having two A tier or 2 very good B tier drivers and then another driver in Stroll that's likely to go up in price. So I think the fact that you're only running one A tier asset certainly sets itself up nicely for a lot of price gain if all of the eventualities for this team work in their favor. But that, I think, you'd have to have a budget almost on the nose of 120. I think it might be 119.8 or something like that, if I'm not mistaken.
Right on the limit there, for sure.
Yeah.
Rob, let's head over and check out the Fantasy Formula League. It is cooking as always. And from last week, a lot of those top teams ran Lewis as their 2X driver, but also a lot of them took the DNF from Leclerc or Ferrari. So it's not just perfect teams that are at the top of this league. The biggest mover in the Fantasy Formulas League was Skipper123, who scored 257 points from running triple Mercedes, McLaren, and Ocon with no chips. So really good week from them. And as always, for those of you keeping track, Limitless topped out at 325 points in this league. So I still lean toward using the Monosprint weekend.
Yeah, I think it was a big win for anyone that had double or triple Mercedes without the DNFs, as you pointed out. So I think it's definitely a good sign that we may be slowly closing the gap, even though it was certainly not a great weekend in Canada. But I think by the time we get to the second half after the summer break, I wouldn't say number one in our league is on the cards for me this season, but I definitely think we could have a good run at cracking the top couple hundred for sure.
So we'll see how things go this weekend in Spain. Unfortunately, Rob, Terry, and I are all out of town, so we can't do a live show this weekend. But we'll be right back here with you next week in the lead up to the Austrian Grand Prix. Rob, will the mustache be back for Austria?
Let's see. It might be a good omen for Valtteri Bottas. I'm really not sure. It was a temporary fixture for the last week, but I might well run it for a stream if the feedback in the comments is anything positive. So if you like the Mo, I'm doing my best Valtteri Bottas impression. Please let me know and I'll keep it up.
Comment section, you know what to do. Save the mustache. Thank you all very much for watching this week, and we will see you for Austria in just 1 week.